Today we're going to start digging into the main feature of our application, and that is meal planning. We're going to build this out using TDD today, and then in a later tutorial we'll add the UI similar to how we did with recipes. The main two things we're going to do today are that we're going to use test-driven development to flush out the behavior of what a meal plan looks like. And then we're also going to do the database modeling behind what a meal plan is. This is a little bit more interesting than what a recipe was because all we had to do when we test drove that was work with validations. The meal plan actually has some logic underneath the hood that is going to be used in order to create a meal plan before we display anything to the user, and then they can customize it from there. Because the idea is to take as much of the decision burden off of the person using this so that they can just go and have a meal plan generated for them, so they don't have to think like, oh, what am I going to eat this week? What did I eat last week? I don't want to have any duplicates, that kind of thing. Before we get too far, we actually do have to fix a mistake that I made when I first generated the application, and that was I called it meal plan. And what happens is when you do Rails new meal plan or Rails new whatever you want your application to be named, they create a module for you with that name that is the basis of all of your application's configuration code. The problem is that I want an actual model to be called meal plan, and I can't do that because the constant already exists. So if we come over here and we go to the application.rb and we look down here, we have a module meal plan. We're just going to change this to meal planner and save that. We got pretty lucky. This is the only spot in the application that uses this module, so it's not a big deal. After you make this change, you will want to restart your Rails application. Okay, moving on to modeling a meal plan. Up until now, most of the stuff that we've worked with is pretty easy to lay out in a database because like each recipe is essentially just one row in a database. A meal plan is going to be a little bit different than that because it's going to be comprised of quite a few different things. Right offhand, the meal plan itself is going to have a start date, an end date, a list of recipes, and a user. That just means like you want to say, I'm going to start my meal plan today. I want it to end a week from today. I'm the one who owns it, so nobody else can see it. And what are the recipes and the dates for those recipes that I'm going to be cooking those on, say. That's not super complicated, but it actually, unlike the normal recipe table that we worked on last time, requires us to create two database tables. Our meal plans table is going to handle our start date, end date, and a user ID. And then we're going to have some other sort of table, which I'm calling meal, that is going to represent a tie between a recipe and a meal plan, because recipes already, they belong to user, right? So they hold that, they can point to a user ID. Well, they can belong to multiple recipes because you're going to reuse the same recipe multiple times over the course of, a year or whatever. But they can't have an ID column to point to a meal plan because of that. This is a many-to-many relationship within our database, and so we're going to have to create a join table for that. And you can, sometimes these would be called like a meal recipe or something, or meal plan recipe. I like to give these more meaningful names. In this case, our join is going to be a meal. Let's generate our migration for our first one is just going to be for the meal plans. So we'll create meal plans. Okay, now that we have that, we can move over here and take a look at it. And like we said, we need a couple date columns, a user ID column, and then since it has many recipes, or meals, we can't have a column for that. So we're going to have a date for start date. Oops. It's not null. End date. A t.references here. This is just a custom thing that Rails gives you that it does a few things. I believe it creates an index behind the scenes too. So we'll use this to say that we need a user ID column. And then we need timestamps also. Okay, one migration down. Now we're going to generate a migration for meals. So we'll just create meals. And here we're going to do something pretty similar. So it needs a date column that's just going to be called date. It's going to not be nullable. And then this will have two references because it belongs to a meal plan and it belongs to a recipe. So it's going to have a meal plan ID and a recipe ID on it. And then we're going to have timestamps too. And for this references line, we can just copy this. Okay, before we get too incredibly far, we'll actually just generate our factory girl factories for this too. So we can do that using Rails G, factory girl, model for meal plan, and then we'll repeat the same thing with a meal. Let's db migrate to make sure everything passes. Okay, cool. So we have our database tables, and now we're ready to actually dig in and do the development of this. We're going to get started by just writing a meal plan test right out the gate. So if we create a new file and test models, make this meal plan test. Okay, the first thing we're going to do, so we know we're going to work with a model here. So we'll do a describe validity block, but it requires a start date. It requires an end date. Whoops, that's not right at all. It requires a user. And that's it for the actual validations there. So we know in this validity block, we're going to need a few things. So we'll create a meal plan. It's going to be an empty one. And then we'll also do a before do meal plan validate. And then I guess we can write these tests out before we get too far too. So we'll need to do the same thing that we did last time, right? So we look at the errors, which are populated when we say valid. And then from here, we just say it must include. And if we go back to the requires part, this is the blank one. So it'll be can't be blank. Okay, and then we're going to have this for all three of these. There are some extra, more fancy validations that we can do for dates, but we're not going to worry about those right now. We might come back and add them later. Now we've got some tests and we can go make these green. So we'll go and first run these just to make sure. Let's test because they should fail. Should give us a really obvious failure this time around too. Okay, uninitialized constant meal plan. That makes a lot of sense. We didn't create the model yet. So in app models, we will create a new file for meal plan. And this will just inherit from application record, and then we'll rerun this test. Oh, I actually have a typo. See, this caught a different bug for us. That's pretty nice. Errors, not error. Okay, there we go. So now it's actually saying that our validations aren't doing anything because they don't exist yet. So if we go back and we remember what this looks like, that we call the validates method, which is a class method that Active Record provides to us, and we say start date, presence true, and then we're going to use this for end date and user. And then while we're in here, I'm going to add a belongs to user so that we can access the user from the meal plan. Okay, let's save that and rerun our tests. Okay, and we're all passing. So we went through the red and the green portion of this. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to continue adding tests to flesh out the rest of what we need. So the big thing that we want here is we want a different describe block. And what are we going to describe here? We want to take a look at what it looks like to generate a meal plan. So we'll just say generating a meal plan or a weekly plan. And then this will need a few things. We're actually only going to worry about one test to start off with. So it populates a meal for each day between the start date and the end date. And then what we're going to do to make this work is we'll say meal plan again, and then we'll build one. And first thing we need to do, is before the build is actually going to work, we need to come through here and create recipes, because what it's going to do is it's going to take a user and we're going to hook it up to use the meal plans user. And whatever user the meal plan has, it's going to look for the recipes that also belong to that user, and it's going to pull from those in order to make sure that it has the recipes for each date. So we have to create one for each of the dates in between there. I'm going to say that our generic meal plan that we're going to build our factory for is going to be a 1-week meal plan, and then so we just need to make sure that we have enough recipes for every day. So in our actual test, we're going to say meal plan, meals, size, must equal 0, because this is before we've done anything. And then we want to meal plan, build meals. So this is us actually doing our thing, and then we're going to assert that a change has been made. So we'll do the same meals thing again, and this should equal 7. So we're not being too specific, right? We're not saying that it has each of these recipes or anything like that. We just want to make sure that when we say build meals, that the number of meals on the meal plan actually changes. If we run this now, we're going to run into errors because we don't have the factory generated for meal plan yet. So before we get too far, we're just going to do that. In here, we need a few things. So we need a start date, which we're going to say is today. And then we need an end date, which is going to be 6 days from now. And this is, active support gives us a lot of helper methods on things based on actions that are pretty common in web development and are a lot of things we're going to do. So one of those things is you want to get a specific date and you want to get it relative to today. And so what it does is it adds a days method onto, it adds a lot of methods actually, onto fixnum, days, hours. And what you can do from there is you can say from now or ago on that, and then it'll actually give you a date time. Oh, so that's a good call. This is going to be a date time. So we'll cast this to date. The other thing that we need is an association on user. We're not going to do anything too fancy here. It'll automatically go and use the user factory. So that should work out just fine for us. If we are very thorough in this, when we run Rails test again, we should get an error saying that build meals doesn't exist yet. Undefined method of meals on meal plan. Oh, that actually makes sense too. So it doesn't know that it has many meals yet. So give it a has many. Save, rerun our tests. Okay, uninitialized constant meal plan meal, because we never generated that model. And oops, we will set this up to belongs to meal plan. Okay, run it again. Okay, undefined method, build meals. So that's where we want it to be. So if we def build meals, save it again, we should get that got 0, expected 7. Okay, awesome. Worked out how we expected. Now we actually get to build this thing out. We're going to build this to be a little more fancy than what the test would kind of drive us to do, just so we don't have to iterate too much coming out. So let's get the recipe IDs first. So we can say user recipes pluck ID. And what that'll do is it will go and it'll return us an array of just the recipe IDs that a user is associated with. And we want to go from start date to end date. And if you're unfamiliar with this syntax right here, the dot dot, we're actually creating a range between two dates. So if today is December the 6th and our end date is December the 13th, this will give us December 6th, December 7th, December 8th, etc., until it gets to the other one. So we can say our available recipe IDs are the user recipe IDs minus meals.map recipe ID. And what this does is it looks for every meal that we already have built and finds the recipe ID. And this is something that we're going to use a little bit of set theory here to make sure that everything is unique up until a certain point. So this will take everything we've got and it'll remove the ones we've already used, and then we can use those available ones as we create more and more meals. So now we can do meals.build, date, and then recipe ID is available recipe ID dot sample, which will just give us a random one. So if we save that now and we come back and we rerun our tests, we should see that it passes. Okay, now we get to flush out a little bit more in here, and I think we're going to write all the rest of our tests right now. So we know that it populates a certain number of meals for us, but now we can assert some other things on those meals. Let's show that each meal that it builds is actually valid. So it builds valid meals. We can do that by saying that MealPlan meals all question mark valid must equal true. And I guess I haven't ever talked about this specific syntax. So if you have a method that takes a block and you want to do a one-liner on it, what you can actually do is this called symbol to proc. You can take the symbol that represents the model that you want to call on each thing inside of an iterator. And if you put an ampersand before it, it will call that on the thing that is yielded into the block and just return that. So in this particular case, we're going to call valid on every single meal and get the array back. Or in this case, all true returns a Boolean for us, but just know that this will be called on everything that we iterate over. Okay, now we're going to talk about some edge cases here. So let's describe with more days than recipes. And so this is the case where I'm not a very good cook, don't have a ton of recipes. So what happens if a meal plan is generated for 7 days, yet I only have 4 days worth of meals or recipes? We want to be able to handle that by, we will duplicate, but we won't duplicate within a short time frame. So if we have 7 days, 7 recipes, we should use all of them. If we have 7 days and 5 recipes, we should duplicate 2 of those. So we're going to have a different meal plan here. This one's just going to be longer than our previous one. And then, oops. It builds valid meals. This is actually a duplicate test, but you'll see in a second that it's actually good for us to do this. And then we're going to have another test down here for it reuses recipes where necessary. So if we build meals at the beginning of this, and then we look at our unique IDs, meal plan, meals, map, recipe ID, unique, So what this does is it goes and gets each recipe ID and then calls unique on it to remove duplicates. And we should be able to assert that we used all 7 of those IDs. So the size of these unique IDs must equal 7. Let's save and go and run this and see how many failures we get. All right, going back and looking, it reuses recipes where necessary. Expected 7, we got 8. So remember, we only created 7 recipes. So this 8th one, I'm going to assume is nil. We can test this out actually by just we can put unique IDs. Save that and rerun our tests. Yeah, this blank space here, actually, it's I think one of these blank spaces is going to be nil. So we do know that that's where we ran into problems. And then this other one is a build valid meals. These expected true actually got false. So that's interesting. Not 100% sure what's wrong there. So let's take a look. Actually, now that I think about it, that does make sense. One of those is we're going to try to create a recipe that has a nil, or a meal that has a nil recipe ID, and that would be the one that's invalid. And we required that all of them be valid. So we can actually fix both these tests in one go. So if we bounce back over to MealPlan, let's see how we can fix this. So rather than just having available recipe IDs, let's create a different variable in here for unused recipe IDs. And this will actually be what we currently have here. So let's just rename this, I guess. Okay. And then from there, what we want to do is we're going to create available recipe IDs again. So this code down here at the bottom is going to stay the same. We just need to add something in between. And that is going to be that we need a kind of an if statement here. So we're going to use if unused recipe ID is empty. Then we'll use a what is this? The ternary operator. So everything, what happens is this first part right here is going to be evaluated. If it's true, it'll do the first chunk of this. If it's false, it'll do what's after the colon. So we're going to put a value in between this question mark and the colon. Then we'll put a value after this colon. And if it's false, it'll use the colon version. If it's true, it'll use the question mark version. It's kind of a fancy way to do a one-line if statement. And actually, this is going to be pretty long. So we'll split this off. We'll just do a normal if statement. So if unused recipe IDs is empty, then we're going to assign available recipe IDs to something. Else, we're going to assign it to something different. So if it's empty, then that means we want to restart with what we had. So in this case, we're going to use the user recipe IDs again. And then if it's not, we will use the unused recipe IDs. I can admit that this isn't great, because what this means is after you go through 7, then every day after that, you have the potential of getting the same meal. So because we're going to use user recipe IDs after 7 days in this case, or after the number of recipes that you own, it'll always pull from the full list. And that means that since we're not popping off things that we're duplicating, we could run into a situation where after 7 days, days 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all use a recipe with the ID of 50, say, and they would all be duplicates, and that would be a problem. But remember, this is just an edge case for people who are using a meal plan that is more than the meal or the recipes that they have in their database. So hopefully that's not a ton of people. So this should still work out because we're using the same variable here. If we save this and we go back and we rerun our tests, hopefully they pass. There we go. We've gone through and we've built out the way to generate a meal for each day of a meal plan using the recipes that a current user has. And notice that we didn't save these though. So doing meals.build will create a new one in memory, but it never saves it. And the reason for this is because we're gonna build out these meals, and then we're gonna populate some UI next week to actually display these to a user and let them modify what are the actual meals that they're using. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Next week, like I said, we're going to continue on and we're going to build out the user interface for meal planning into our application. But let me know what you thought about this particular tutorial. And if you like and share this particular tutorial, I'd really appreciate that. And you should head over to CoderJourney.com and subscribe to the newsletter. I give you updates on when new tutorials come out, and I'm probably going to start doing a little bit of writing instead of just video content pretty soon. So you'll also get updates on when that stuff comes out. So have a nice week.